So I thought I'd start by answering some homework questions. So if you have homework questions, put them into Piazza or just shout them in the room. Okay, Okay, so here was a question. When do we need to begin adding the Java doc? I will let you know. The documentation that you really should be doing, just to be good citizens, is for every method you should have @param, @return. And you really should just be doing that right now. There's no reason not to. But in a week or two, it will be enforced. And actually, you'll know because when you submit to NetBRAD, it'll let you know that they're missing. So that's when you know that it's absolutely going to be a requirement. Okay, other homework questions? All right, so I'll talk about something, and hopefully that'll motivate you to ask a few questions. So someone had a question earlier today about homework 1, and so what they did is they would read a line of homework A. They would read in a line, and you know how it has a string here, it had another string here, and another one here, and at the end it had these three things that were probably numbers. And so what the fellow did is he said string line equals in.next line. And then he had that string there. And he said, well, how am I going to identify those numbers? And so he took an index, went all the way to the end, and that was the right thing to do, right? Because the numbers are at the end. Would go forward, would find that space. Do we know whether it's a space? So if you say line.char@ of I equal space, do we know that that's going to find the space? Well, yes or no? What else could it be? Oh my. It could be a tab. Right, a tab is white space. So how do you test for a tab? So I guess you could test for it, right? That's a tab. And when you get a file in the wild, you really never quite know what it is. It's very easy to get files with tabs. Like if you copy them out of a spreadsheet, they often have them. Or even if you copy and paste something out of a web page where it's a table, sometimes you get tabs instead of spaces. So you'd probably want to check for that. But that's really tedious. What I would do is there's a method in character.is white space, and then you feed in that character, line.char@. So these static methods are really useful. I pointed that out last time. This character is white space, character is digit, and so on. And they let you analyze this kind of stuff. But still, so when I looked at what the fellow set out to do, I've done this in my life. You then go back and find the previous one. Then you call substring to extract the string that's between these two. And then you go from there. And yes, you can do it like that, but I think there's an easier way. So let me tell you what the easier way is. How do I erase this thing? So the easier way goes like this. You read it in like you had before. What is string in? String line equals in.next line. Then you make another scanner. Let me call it in2. And you make that scanner from this line. And now you use that scanner while in to.hasNext. And then you call in to.next. And now that gives you each of the chunks, each of those 7 or 8 or 9 chunks as an individual string. And now what do you do with them? I put them in an array list. So I have an array list string A. There's a new array list. And so now I have each of these chunks in a little array list. In this array list. And now it's really easy to deal with them. I need to take the last 3 and total them up. Where are the last 3? Well, they're right here. How do I get them out of the array list? This one here, for example, would be a.get of a, so what is it, size minus 1. a.size minus 1. Right? So it took what? It took 4 lines to dump them in an array list, and then I no longer have to monkey around with an index that goes from the back and hunts for spaces and extracting substrings. So the advantage of this approach is less room for error. Right? Fussing around with an integer index is always room for error. You could always be off by 1. And you have ample opportunities to be off by 1. So this thing here, it's pretty easy. So similarly, I want to find out, what are the next 3 ones to deal with the president's name. Well, those are going to be these ones here. At index, whatever, size minus 4, minus 5, and minus 6. Yeah?
How about the logic that provided tool?
The what?
That provided tool.
Okay, so now the other question is, how do I now analyze these strings? So each of them is a string, and I have to attach a numeric value to it. So let's do that. So now I need a new sheet. Go away. Here. All right. So now I have this. Oh, hey. I have the string, and it could be like 1, 4, 3. There was a $sign in front, comma 582, something like that. Or if this president really makes a lot of money. How do I get rid of the commas? One word. Yeah?
I didn't mind that.
Yes, exactly. So replace, right? So you do s dot replace comma with the empty string. That replaces all commas with the empty string. That method was actually, if you remember, in chapter 2 of the book. It was one of the very first things when we learned how to make method calls. Now, what you said is actually, I hadn't thought of that. He said he simply did that with the entire input line instead of separately with each of them. That sounds legitimate too. We just now because we know that the president's names wouldn't have commas in them. How do I get rid of the $? Same thing. I can even chain the calls like that because s.replace returns a string, so I can take that string and hit it with another replace. And now I've nixed all of those. For what? I don't want to... oh, now you're giving me a new idea that I hadn't had before, but hey, I'll run with it. I could replace provided with the number 0. That sounds like a very ingenious idea, because now I don't have to make the test if the string. I had a special case that says if the string is provided, then skip it or something. But hey, this is great. So now I have, after I've done that, and I've grabbed off my numbers, which were here, the ones here. Then, of course, now I have them as strings. How do I turn them back into numbers? Yeah, now I can use integer parseInt to turn them back into numbers. So integer parseInt of that entire thing, where S was what was the string that I fished out. Do it 3 times, add them up, and you're done. So now, so I talked to this the student who asked me this question, who had this long and convoluted code that had the long string that started backwards with an integer index, that slowly moved forwards, that started finding some of these things. And so I told him this other way of doing things that I just described you. Dump everything in an array. Get it out of the array. And so I looked at him, and it became clear that he was not about to adopt my suggestion. And now, why was that? And so this is a common problem that people have. And it's a common problem that people have everywhere. And if you had gone to business school instead of studying computer science, you would have had a lecture on sunk cost. So in business, the situation is your company goes out and builds a factory, spends $10 million to build this factory on somewhere in the outskirts of some town to build widgets. Takes 2 years. In those 2 years, something bad has happened, that the price of the widgets has gone down to the point that if you were to start turning on the factory and crunching out those widgets and selling them to whatever they can fetch, you would lose $2 a widget. What should you do with the factory? Should you turn it on, or should you walk away from it? If you turn it on and you manage to produce 1 million widgets, well, you've just lost $2 million, right? You lose $2 a widget. If you walk away from it, well, if you lost all the money that it cost to build the factory, that was a lot of money. And so in business school, they tell you it doesn't matter what you already spent. You never look back, you always look forward. It's completely immaterial how much money you already spent because you spent it. That money you will never get back. It's a sunk cost. And the same thing is true for programming. If you've been programming following one scheme, and that scheme has only brought you modest success, meaning that you think you're another 10 hours away maybe from solving your problem if you keep on trucking with that scheme. It doesn't matter that you already spent 20 hours getting to that point. Those 20 hours that you have spent in the past are a sunk cost. If someone suggests to you what might be a better scheme, you have to evaluate whether it's better only looking into the future. Is it going to enable you to finish your job now in 1 hour instead of 10 hours? In that case, it doesn't matter that you spent 20 hours on the other scheme, and you should embrace the new idea. If, on the other hand, you're 90% there, again, it doesn't matter how long it took you to get to the 90%. If the remaining 10% is less than switching to the other, you should do that. So this will often happen to you that you read something like a brilliant suggestion, and many people just don't adopt it because they have invested so much in the old way that they've been doing. When you find yourself thinking about that, when you find yourself thinking about how much time and love you have already invested in that previous code, just remember, sunk cost. It doesn't matter how much time you have invested in it. Your code is not a love affair. It's all you want to do is you want to throw it away when a better way offers itself. If you feel bad about throwing away, print it out and put it on the wall somewhere and then erase it. So in this situation, I think that the approach of going through this array using the secondary scanner is likely to be so much faster than going through there backwards and using the array indexes that I would go for that. And, you know, I've just learned something. The trick with the replacing provided with a 0 is totally brilliant. And so I should put that into my code. Except I'm done, so my cost going forward is 0, so I may not. In the first assignment, it's an easy assignment because there's no error checking that you have to do. I'm not going to give you a president whose middle name is provided. So you can simply go ahead and replace all provideds with 0. I'm not going to make you give you numbers that are malformed where there might be like 2 commas. So you can expect that the input is perfect. So in the second homework, that's not the case, right? In the second homework, I'm making you do error checking, and so you have to actually do some of those error checks. I will give you some wrong inputs that you need to be prepared for. Let's see if we got any more questions. Actually, I should be on Piazza. Hang on. Because I now have a network. So here we have a great question. How do we put the comma back into the output so that instead of 300,000, it prints 300, comma 000? So he's gotten from 300,000 in a string, and now he has it as an integer. No. So how do you do it? Yes, so the easy way to do it is with printf. The hard way to do it would be to turn it back into a string and to figure out where to put the commas, but that's not what I would recommend. So system.out.printf, and so it's a percent, it's a decimal number, and then the marker is comma. Comma produces the locale-specific decimal separator. Yeah, do that. So printf is your friend. Do we have to skip the first line? Yes, you always skip the first line. So the line that says campus president, salary, housing, auto allowance, you can assume that line is there, and you can completely ignore it. You just skip it. How do you skip the line? Yeah, you just say in.next line, you don't even look at the answer. Okay. Can we move forward and backwards while analyzing a string? That's a good question. So we read in a line of stuff, and let's say we're still in that first problem where we now have a bunch of strings, and you could absolutely move forward and backwards. You could have an integer j here, and you can have an integer I here, and you can do I++ so that it keeps looking this way, and j minus minus, and you can look at any of the positions in the string this way. And sometimes you have to do that. But it's something that I would avoid when I can. So that's why I dumped the strings in an array, that I didn't have to deal with the individual characters in there. But sometimes you can't do that, and then, yes, you have to set these indexes, and you can go in any old direction. Now let's see, in the context of the homework, where do we actually have to do this? In the first homework, what I told you about dumping them in an array is I think, the winning strategy. In the second one, do you read them in a line at a time or a word at a time? You must read them a line at a time because lines are significant, right? It matters where the end of a line, where the beginning of a line is, because it says if a line starts with A and the parentheses. So with the second one, you definitely read them in a line at a time. And there's probably no benefit of breaking that line down further. The very first line is the title. Then all the other lines as they come in, you want to concatenate to some long string. And then you need to look for whether the line starts with an A or maybe an asterisk A. And that one you probably do need to put in an index here, and you check, is there an asterisk? If there is an asterisk, you remember it and you increment I. And then you see, is there an A, B, C, or D? And if so, you check whether it's in sequence. Well, I guess you should first check whether there's a parentheses. And so you increment the index again and you check whether there's a parentheses. And so that one you look from the start. I suppose if you wanted to, you could have 8 cases, right? Does it start with star A, with star B, star C, star D, or just A, B, C, or D? But that's ugly. I think it's easier to do it right and look at it this way. Okay, we have some Cygwin problems that I think we'll tackle in the lab. More homework questions? You must have homework questions. Otherwise, I'll make them harder next time.
The third one, is it reading from a file or just input?
Which one?
The third one.
The third part is reading from standard input only. So the third one will always read in from system.in. There's no file name. How are you going to test it? I mean, you have before you send it up to NetBrat. So the third one, the way I would test it is definitely on the command line. I would run, Java. So I would just wherever in which directory it is in, I would cd to whatever directory, source Java C. And then compile it, and then Java, whatever the name was, homework 3, C, and then less than some file. And then you'll see what happens. So open up a shell window, use the command line. That's the easiest way to do it. Yeah. Yeah?
How do you go back up?
You can't.
So once you go down...
Yes, so that's a very good question. So when you read something with the scanner and you call it next or next int or next double or next line, there's never a going back. So once you have grabbed the input, you paid for it, you bought it. You can't return it.
So just make sure you don't analyze it.
Well, it means that sometimes you have to really ask yourself, what is my algorithm? What is the scheme in which I'm doing it? And so if you look at what I did with the first assignment, the way that I was able to go back is I took the input and then I dumped it in an array. And so that is something that you can always do. So and in fact, that may be a good strategy in the B part. So if you find that you're having trouble with the B part, that stuff slips out of your hands, you could certainly keep on calling next line and just dump all of the things into an array of lines.
When you do that, I'm in an array list, and is it like the first part or array list 0? Is that like the whole line, or would that just be the first word?
It's up to you. You're putting it in the array list. So
next line, it'll be the whole line, but next it'll just be that word.
That's right. Yeah. Now, it would strike me that in B, it's a line-oriented input, and you only care about entire lines. So there you would want to make an array list that stores all the lines. And you can just, the same loop that you've seen before will work. You say, while in.has next line, lines.add in.next line, and bingo, now you have everything in an array list, and you no longer have to worry about the pain of that you only have one chance to look at everything. Now, I didn't do it because it turned out not to be necessary in this case, but if you find it easier, there's no penalty for it. The only time where I'm prescribing how you need to do things is in C. In C, I said, I really, really want you to read a character at a time because I wanted you to practice what it's like if you can only see a character at a time. And it is painful, right? Because you're exploring the world and you can only see this far. And when you go a step, you can't go back. It's a terrible life. And so you have some memory, of course. You can remember what you've seen before, like the way that you deal with periods is you can set a Boolean flag or a counter to see whether you've seen one before. And so that way, as you go through that loop, you can see, did I see two of them in a row? With the words, the same thing. You have to ask yourself, am I in the middle of the word or am I in the beginning of a word? But for A and B, you're free to buffer anything in an array and go from there. Other questions? Yeah, when I say array, I always mean array list. Yeah, there's no... When would you use an array? Just as a general question. In regular real-life programming, when do you use an array? There's only one situation when you use an array. When your instructor tells you. Otherwise, you'd be crazy to use an array. Why would you want to use an array? An array list is always simple. So, but sometimes I'll tell you for one reason or another. So generally, you would prefer an array list. Other homework questions? Yeah?
For 3C, do you want us to test it with the Alice file?
Yes, I do want you to test it with the Alice. And in fact, I've gotten some disturbing reports where people said that the counts were wrong.
Yeah, do you want us to fix it so it's...
I mean, the thing is bugging me enough that I'll put up I'll run my program through some other test file to see whether we can't get to the ground of it. I'll put it on Piazza. If I don't, send me a reminder. I mean, it's with this kind of thing, it's possible that I'm wrong, right? And so I want to know whether I'm wrong or whether you guys are wrong. Did anyone, just out of curiosity, did anyone get the exact same count that I got? Not the same sentences, huh? Okay, I'll double check that. Yeah, we'll want to get to the ground of it. It may be that I miscounted the sentences, or whether... I mean, the question is, what happens if you have 2 periods in a row, or 4 periods? And the way I counted it is, I said, that's not a sentence. You have to have a single period. And maybe someone could look into the Alice file and see if that ever happens, that you have some funny number of periods in a row. That's kind of the only thing I can think of. Maybe they have like 2 question marks in a row or a question mark, exclamation mark. I don't even know what I would do in that situation. All right, other questions? Okay, then I'm going to rush through what I was supposed to talk about in the lecture, but it's not as interesting as the homework. So, checked exceptions, it's really simple. A bunch of exceptions are checked, and you know when they're checked. They are checked that when you don't do anything, the compiler is going to say something bad about you not doing anything with it. And so what always happens to me is I call some method that throws a checked exception. I forget all about it. I compile. The compiler says, you didn't handle this exception. And then I know it was a checked exception. Then what do? In 99 out of 100 cases, I take the name of the exception and put a throws specifier on the method that I'm writing. Because most of the time, I'm not ready to handle exceptions. Most of the time, I'm processing the regular case. And so I just want to advertise that these exceptions might be thrown. There's no shame in using throws. It's best to use throws. Whenever you have a checked exception, try to throw it up as far to the outside of the program that you can. So I'm not going to do this in the interest of time. Catching exception. So do you need to catch an exception? Well, in the homework, you don't need to catch every exception. In fact, you shouldn't catch every exception, particularly in part B. Your main method must throw out a bunch of exceptions. So when there is an input mismatch, whenever there's something wrong with the input, your main method must throw the input mismatch exception. The tester will call your main method. It's perfectly possible for a program to call the main method of another program. And it'll then, on its own, expect those exceptions. If those exceptions don't come out, the tester will say, well, they're not throwing the right exceptions. So which exceptions do you need to catch? I believe in the homework you need to catch a file not found exception, and in that case, emit an error message. So if you have that kind of instructions, you need to make a try block, and you need to make this kind of catch block. Except you need to catch a file not found exception here. And then you just print out a message just like this that says, it's not been a beautiful day, and that's all. So generally there's not too much else that you can do when you catch one of these exceptions. Generally you can just notify the user. Maybe you have a loop where you ask them to provide an input again or something. But in this case, we don't even do that. We just exit the program. Exceptions and inheritance. There's not much to this either. It's just that the exceptions do form an inheritance hierarchy, so some of them are more specialized than others. I know you can't see this. It's in Bacteria font here. So as an example, there's an IO exception class here. And it has a subclass EOF exception or file not found exception. And what that means is that if any of those subclasses gets thrown, you can catch them as the superclass. So if someone throws a file not found exception, you can catch it as an IO exception, or even as an exception, or even as a throwable if you select. And so that's occasionally handy. So you don't want to do this? No. Okay, maybe I'll come back to this in a minute. But finally, the finally clause, I'll just give you the canonical use of the finally clause. So generally, when you want to read or write something from a file or from a scanner, or you write to a print writer, you want to close the thing. Here we're reading data, and we close, and so it always works like this. You call the read data, whatever instructions there are, and you surround the entire thing with this finally, and the in.close comes here. Now, one of two things happens. Most of the time, read data will be successful. We come through here, we come through the finally, and we close the file. Once in a while, read data will maybe call another method, calls another method, blows up. An exception gets thrown. And that exception goes somewhere, wherever it gets caught, but on the trip back, the finally clause is still executed and our file is closed. Now, do you need to close a scanner? And that's something that is really between you and your maker. The truth is that if you don't close the scanner, nothing terrible will happen, unless your program opens thousands of them, which will take you a while to get to that point. So it's not, one doesn't have to get too excited about it. Do you have to close a print writer? And the answer is absolutely yes, because if you don't close a print writer, then data gets lost. So it's a good habit to close everything inside, and so it's a good habit to use that try finally pattern. Now actually, because that pattern is so common, and because it's so tedious to write the try finally, they have a nifty shortcut in Java 7, and I would absolutely invite you to use that shortcut. All your programs will get compiled by the grader in Java 7, so you don't have to worry about it, and that's the one down here. So in a couple of years, that's what everyone is going to be doing once Java 7 becomes ubiquitous. So instead of try finally, you just have a single try, and you cram the declaration for the thing that needs to be closed inside here. Instead of kind of putting it outside, you just put it right in there, and then you put whatever needs to be done with it in here. It's kind of the same thing as saying for int a colon values, where this thing is an array. It's kind of the same syntax, or a similar syntax. They could have made it the same syntax. So you just declare this variable in here. You can use it inside the block, and it gets auto-closed. And so you can do that with scanners, with file writers. That's the fashionable new way to do this. Okay. All right, we'll do one just for fun. Go to Piazza. Okay, here's a question. Who was supposed to check this question? You still need to check the questions. Well, the trouble is there's two right answers. 45. Hey guys. Okay, so let's just go through this. So, so we have in. Oops, sorry. Starts out with null, and now we have new file of file name, and so this file doesn't exist. So what exception does the scanner constructor throw? File not found exception. So it throws a file not found exception. Does the finally clause get executed? Yes or no? It always gets executed. The finally clause always gets executed. What happens when the finally clause gets executed? It calls in.close. What is in? What is in? It's null, right? What happens when you call null.close? What happens when you call null.close? Will it just silently ignore it? No. What happens when you invoke any method on null? You must know from experience. What happens when you invoke any method on null? You get a null pointer exception. All of you must have gotten dozens of null pointer exceptions in your life. I certainly have. So that means that C must be the right answer.
Does it not print anything?
Unfortunately, A is also the right answer because it does also, on its way, it does print IO error.
Isn't it A wrong because it's not the right stance?
Excellent. So is it wrong? We're catching an IO exception. We threw a file not found exception, and we're catching an IO exception. And so the question is, will it grip? Will it catch it? And yes, it will, because an IO exception is a superclass of a file not found exception. So when you throw a file not found exception, you can catch it as a file not found exception, as an IO exception, as an exception, or as a throwable. And so it will get caught, and yes, it will print IO error. You said there was a syntax error.
On print line.
Where's the syntax error?
Print line.
Oh, there might be some function.
Is this the dot out stuff?
Oh, I see. Let's just assume that println was defined as a function elsewhere. So that's not. I see it. That it's not necessarily. Oh, that saves me actually. Okay, unbeknownst to you, what println actually does, it's a method that I defined that does nothing. So that way it would print it. No. So I should have proofread it. All right. So both A and C are correct. Let's see. And the majority opinion was A. And a few hardy souls, bless their hearts, did type C. All right. Excellent. All right, let's go on to the lab. I added a bit of stuff to the lab. Let me just show you real quick. so that you guys no longer have that pain with path names and stuff. And it's again going to be one of those fiddly things where we're just going to have to make sure that everyone gets this right. So I added on the parts H and I. I added 2 H's. Okay, so there should have been I and J. So pick up where you left off last time. I know a bunch of you got done, so then let's pick up at the second H here, and let's make sure that everyone now gets their Emacs configuration right, that they get their .bash profile right, and that they don't ever have to suffer with a path again. And I'll be walking around to checking out everyone's machine.